such, breadcrumbs. I want to dive straight into the questions that Kazi posed, and I think these are extremely important questions for asking about usually for the next few decades. I think the question of what is development has sort of puzzled scholars, academics, activists for several decades, if not centuries. And I think we need to look at both parts of the question that Kazi posed, the sustainability and the development. And especially when we think about sustainable development, we need to think about the ways in which, this process or development has to be sort of made sustainable and kept sustainable. Now, development in the past used to mean things like economic growth, it used to mean infrastructure, and then over the last decades, thanks to interventions by it has come to mean things like human capabilities, human development, things like education, health, democracy. Increasingly, we've realized that these are not enough. And recently, an anthropologist I think he's at the London School of Economics, called Jason Hickel, has talked about the Sustainable Development Index, which takes us away from the Human Development Index, where he talks about ways in which different countries may undertake development without causing too much of a damage to the climate, without sort of exploiting natural resources to the extent that development is not sustainable. I think if we build on all of these perspectives, we need to sort of consider new ways in which the question of development is being understood. But we do need to keep in mind the old questions, and we do have to come back to what is this thing called development, whether we say human development, whether we say sustainable development. And I think in answering that question, we need to recognize that development is a process. At the end of the day, it's a process. It's a process of social change, it's a process of economic change, it's a process of political change. Yeah. And it's a process of change that holds at its center a respect for human dignity. I think far too often when we talk about development, we ignore questions of dignity and we ignore questions of human dignity. And by human dignity, I don't only mean dignity as understood by scholars in the 18th century Europe, drawing on a very Kantian understanding of individual dignity. Human dignity has had different origins across the world, whether it's in Haiti in the 18th and 19th centuries, whether it's in South Asia in the 16th and 17th centuries, whether it's in Central Asia, China, Southern Africa, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, across the world, different communities, different people have had different understandings of dignity. But I think there is a shared I won't say consensus, but there are resonances with what people mean by dignity. And I think that really needs to be foregrounded in the understanding of development. Of course, this sort of thinking about dignity has to be in harmony with the environment, with climate. There have to be ways in which we consider interactions between humans and non-humans. And the current pandemic in which we are living actually brings this up very, very starkly. Human beings are not independent of bats and pangolins. We all coexist and we share the earth. And of course, there is the adage about how we have not only inherited the earth from our ancestors, but are borrowing it from our descendants. So if we think about sustainable development in a way that foregrounds dignity as well as human, non-human relationships, I think we can begin to sort of understand a little about sustainable development. Now, over the last 50 years, there were certain very conventional ways in thinking about development. The moment we thought about development, it used to be about how rich developed countries would support poor developing countries. Yeah? Typically, the developed countries would be in what's called the global north. and the developing countries would be in the global south. And there was this almost hierarchy of north countries helping the global south. Now,
Dr. Roy,
yes.
I think it would be okay if you close down your video because there's a lot of distortion in your voice. I mean, it just drops quite frequently.
Okay, thank you. I'll shut the video now. Great. Are you able to hear me any better?
Yes, it's perfectly fine for now.
Okay, yes. Do let me know if my voice drops off or you can't hear. So we need to now recognize that there are changes in even these ways of thinking about development. We have more and more influential in development. We have the rise of actors such as China, such as India, the BRICS economies more broadly, who are taking on new roles in global development. We have new processes that have been unleashed, and within these countries, we have new agents who are becoming more important than ever before. Among these agents are young people. And I think this brings me to the bit about, what can young people do? Now, decades ago, the idea that young people might be able to influence global politics seemed very important. But when you think about individuals such as Greta Thunberg or Malala Yousafzai, and you think about the ways in which they've got us to understand new ways of looking at the world, new ways of understanding the world, we begin to see how new actors are defining and shaping our understandings of development, of human dignity. Not only are they helping us to think about new ways of understanding development, but they are also providing us with the kind of leadership that sometimes older people have simply not been able to demonstrate. And both Greta Thunberg and her colleagues and Malala Yousafzai and her colleagues have sort of showed us this way of leading from the front. And finally, I think we cannot ignore anymore the role of the media, especially the social media. And one might not associate apps like TikTok and Instagram with development, but I think these are new platforms that have democratized the ways in which people communicate. Of course, there is always the challenge that these platforms could be appropriated and exploited by big governments, by corporates who want your data. But remember, these are also platforms that have made it possible for young women from remote villages, from small towns, to make their voices heard, to be present in the public sphere in a way that would not have been possible a few decades ago. So I want to close these brief introductory remarks by reminding us about how development is about dignity, how sustainable development is about ensuring that dignity goes hand in hand with harmonious human and non-human relations, and by thinking about the new actors in development, in global development, whether these are countries from the global south, such as the BRICS economies, but also agents within these countries in the global north and the global south, particularly young people who have showed us new ways of looking at the world and new ways of leading us into this new world. I don't want to romanticize the role of young people, and I'm sure we will come to the challenges and the difficulties in the course of the conversation, but let us begin on an optimistic note. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Roy, for your response to a very important consideration, a very important aspect, that is understanding what development really is and what role can young people possibly perform in order to play their part in this entire developmental discourse. So I thank you very much for your contribution, and we will be getting back to you again in due course of the program. And I guess there will be questions. And those of you who are listening, you can think about the aspects that are raised during the conversation, during the discussion, and you can write down your questions in advance for us to get back to you later on. So moving on with this developmental discourse and understanding the role of the youth, possibly a possible role of the youth in this entire discussion of developmental challenges and developmental progress. So I would move towards the next participant and the next panelist that we have today, Mia Villamayor. She is joining us from the US. She is currently an incoming sophomore, like I introduced in the very beginning, at UC Berkeley. She's doing she's double majoring in political science and interdisciplinary studies, health security with a minor in public policy. So Mia, thank you very much for joining us today. Talking of developmental challenges, my question would be to you, what do you think are some of the priority areas in terms of developmental challenges that hold utmost relevance for the youth of today?
Thank you. I can immediately think of 4 problems. That is positively shaping the development of artificial intelligence, global priorities research, building effective altruism, and climate change. But in order to understand why I selected these problems, we need to ask, what does it mean to make an impact? Concisely, it's about promoting welfare over the long term. But with so many problems plaguing our world, there are 5 factors that influence how I decide what problems should be prioritized. So 1, it should have an impartial concern for welfare. So no particular community should be privileged, and similarly, no community should be excluded. Secondly, effective altruism. That is, it is in our best interest to help 2 people more than 1, and unfortunately, some charities are much more effective than others. Thirdly, expected value, which is the technical term for adding up all the good and bad potential consequences of an action and weighted by their probability, and similarly, counterfactual. So we believe that the consequences of an action should be evaluated relative to what would have happened if the action were not taken. Fourthly, long-termism. So the average species lasts for 1 to 10 million years, and Homo sapiens, as we know ourselves, have been around for only 200,000. There can be a huge number of future generations, and it is in our best interest as a species, and particularly as youth, to care for them. And lastly, moral uncertainty and moderation. I don't want to take a purely utilitarian view or assume that some morals can and can never change, when if you look over the course of, I think, moral philosophy, it's changed quite a bit. So using these 5 factors, climate change easily poses an extreme risk, and youth should take the reins in transforming the world for the better. So sustainable development is an essential fork of the multi-pronged solution to one of the most pressing problems, that is climate change. Already, changes in our environment have yielded a new crop of environmental refugees, wildfires, and much more. And even if countries abided by their commitments under the Paris Agreement, at the higher end of this range, there will likely be very significant humanitarian harms, including food and water shortages, large-scale displacement of vulnerable populations, and decreased global stability. But most interestingly, extreme climate change can actually pose an existential risk to humanity. So a possible scenario could be that the Earth becomes so hot, it becomes uninhabitable for human life. That's very real. Thus, sustainable development is not so much an option as it is a necessity for ensuring the survival and betterment of humanity. And considering that youth have proved their capabilities as leaders, from Greta Thunberg to Malala Yousafzai, and have an essential stake in fighting climate change, youth must be the ones to lead the widespread prioritization and implementation of sustainable development. So again, 5 factors that influenced my thinking and highlighted climate change. It's impartial concern for welfare. Again, no community should be privileged, no community should be excluded. Secondly, effective altruism. We should try to help as many people as we can in the most effective ways possible. We should approach and include a scientific perspective. Expected value and counterfactuals. We should look at the probability of all of this. We should look at the consequences of action versus inaction, opportunity cost, if you will. Long-termism, we should look in the long run, and moral uncertainty and moderation. We shouldn't take any extreme perspectives. So these were the 5 factors that influenced my decision-making with why climate change and sustainable development in our youth is a real pressing problem and should be tackled head on. So thank you.
Right. So that's an interesting perspective, I would say. I mean, a really interesting point has been raised in which Mia has rightly said that sustainable development is not really an option. It's actually a necessity. And then we are also, discussing some aspects of human dignity and morality and human welfare, which is also not being looked upon from the utilitarian perspective, but a view has been shared specifically by the speakers that we need to think about the possibilities of trying to help as many people as we possibly can. Good thoughts coming up. I would urge the audience to think about these ideas, toss them around while you listen to others mention and share their views, and we can get back to you when the question and answer session starts. So moving forward, we have yet another amazing young person joining us from Kenya. So my question to Allan Mwaniki would be to further the discussion would be, so Allan, you are joining us from Kenya. You're currently pursuing your degree in law. So my question to you would be that according to you, according to you, do you think that the youth of today are actually prepared for all the challenges that we are facing right now or that we might face in near future? So I would be really happy to hear your views. Let me just shed the spotlight on you. Yeah, please.
Thanks. I think my short answer would be no. It might be gloomy, but I'll give you reasons. I think we approach youth as a homogeneous demographic, while it's not. We are exposed to multiple exclusions due to the nuance that youth as a demographic is exposed to. So, for example, we have the intersectional nature of the challenges that face us. We have the rural-urban divide, we have gender, we have religion, we have race, disability, citizenship, and statelessness. All these challenges are yet to be effectively unpacked. So, are we prepared? I would say no. Let me give you a run through on the challenges that we face in the various spheres of influence. If you may, we have poverty affecting young women, and largely due to the blatant disregard of unpaid care work. We have young people denied education, where young girls are being married off. We have young men being enlisted in militia. These are in war-torn areas. We have large populations of stateless youth. We have indecent work, capture of resources by the elite, and normalizing of corruption. This then goes back to the entire discussion that I'm really glad that Dr. Roy has brought up, which is human dignity. All of these things then go to completely curtail human dignity. So again, we are not effectively prepared due to the poor unpacking of these challenges. However, it's not all gloom. I think youth are enterprising and youth are quite innovative. In my home country in Kenya, we have had young people coming up with face masks, cloth face masks, which are being used during the COVID-19 pandemic, which are reusable, which then it makes it a bit easier for the population to deal with the COVID-19 situation while also being quite fashionable. We have the youth are hyper-connected globally, as Dr. Roy has actively pointed out. We have Twitter, we have Facebook, and citizen movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement. We have the hashtag End Police Brutality KE movement in my country, where young people are actively taking up roles in activism and agitation and championing and campaigning using the tools that are presented to them, albeit in instances where the gatekeepers are curtailing their voices And we also have youth grassroots and community-led movements being quite effective. Again, I'd go back to the example in my country where we have more and more young people in the slum areas providing water. We see them paving roads and providing street lighting using their own ingenious and quite enterprising ways. So I think youth are enterprising and youth are innovative. So I propose two-pronged solutions, or rather two ways of how to go about the whole challenge. I think we have youth-sponsored solution and we have state-sponsored solutions. Youth-sponsored solutions, youth are advised, I would advise youth to reclaim their agency, organizing and mobilizing. We've seen how Greta Thunberg has done it. We've seen Vanessa Nakate from Uganda. We've seen Malala. We've seen all these young people being quite influential, and the UN estimates up to 1.8 billion people being between the ages of 10 to 24. Sorry, I think with these numbers, with better organization, we'd be able to reclaim our agency and better champion for for the realization of what we want, or rather to deal with the problems that we are facing rather. The second is the state-sponsored solutions, including affirmative action. I think states or governments should create laws specifically for the youth, allowing them spaces, allowing them a seat at the table, talking about development, talking about the issues that matter to them, talking about the challenges that they are facing, so we can have more and more youth occupying spaces in the critical mass, in parliament, in the executive. Using the UN model, we can be able to champion and create more and more slots that are going to be effective for the championing of rights and championing of human dignity that many young people are being denied across the globe. I also believe that governments should rely heavily on aggregated data. The problem in relying on this whole understanding of youth as a homogeneous demographic is quite problematic, in my opinion, and I think data is quite necessary. Understand who are the disabled, who are the women, how many stateless individuals do we have. With this sort of data, even the medium to long-term plans that our development trajectory is going to take are going to be heavily effective, in my opinion. And third and final, I'll talk about human-centered governance. I think our governance should value human life above making profit, above the capitalistic understanding of society, really. Let's have fairer taxation models. It's quite unfair that young people, young enterprising individuals get to pay more taxes than multinational corporations who then cut off large profits to the global north, while in effect leading to massive environmental degradation, more and more human rights violations in our various countries, as has been reported by the various state media and by the various international media, really. So I think with these solutions, we'd be better placed. We wouldn't be the best placed, but it's a step in the right direction. So thank you.
That was a very interesting take, I would say. You mentioned two specific approaches in which you mentioned that there is a youth-sponsored solution to the problems and that there is a state-sponsored solution to the problems. And I mean, it's really interesting that you mentioned that young people need to reclaim their agency in order to take command and take control of the problems and actively and proactively, I would say, offer solutions since they are more innovative. You know, as compared to other stakeholders. So that's an interesting proposition, I would say, and an interesting addition to the entire discourse that we are having today in regards to the development challenges and the developmental progress that we are all collectively aiming for. Yeah, so moving forward, I would once again move towards Dr. Roy. So we all know that we are amidst a global health crisis in the face of, in terms of, yeah, in the face of COVID-19 that we are all uniformly, or we can say commonly facing today. So Dr. Roy, I would like to pose this question that considering this global health crisis, do you think that COVID has wiped off the developmental progress that we have made? And does this mean that the challenges for the youth have actually increased manifold? So if yes or no, I mean, we would really want to hear what your opinion is. And in either situation, in case if it has increased the challenges for the young people, what do you think is the current situation demands from the youth of today?
Great question. I will shut down my video again so that there are no issues like there were earlier. But I just wanted to show my face to say I'm here and I'm listening.
Perfect.
Right. There's no doubt that the pandemic has wiped out the progress that was made in the last 2 decades. There is work done by the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, which suggests that the reductions in poverty that we had achieved in the last 2 decades have been reversed. So there is the chance of more people slipping into poverty, hereafter, which is a major reversal from what we had seen earlier. Now, that said, Arundhati Roy recently wrote about the pandemic being a portal to a new world. And I don't necessarily agree with the rather romanticized view that this might hold, but we do need to bear in mind that the pandemic may have opened up new opportunities that may not have struck us in the past. One such opportunity that shows up is, that is clear, is the way in which, like I said, new development actors have taken on a role. Our colleague from Kenya talked about how overnight face masks were produced in Kenya, which tells us a great deal about human resilience and the way in which people are able to sort of, get on and respond to situations of crisis. We are seeing a complete collapse of the institutions which we had really looked up to. These are institutions such as the state. In the global north, definitely governments have failed their people in many, many countries, including the superpower, the United States. And that has brought attention to the role of what people can and should do. And I think what this has really done is to open up new ways of thinking about what can be done in order to achieve developmental outcomes. We heard about anti-oppression movements. Certainly, we've heard about the Black Lives Matter movements, which have, again, taken the global north by storm. And that points us to the ways in which young people's agency is being reclaimed in such a difficult era. So while the pandemic has reversed the developmental gains of the last 2 decades, there's no doubt about it. There are also opportunities that there are ways in which the Global South is sort of making its presence felt, simply because the Global North is in no position to help the Global South because we will be seeing declines where sort of role than they were before. And as
Roy, sorry for interrupting. Could you please come again? Could you please mention the last point you mentioned, because there was a lot of disruption and the voice dropped.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's better.
Okay. Oh, no, I just summarized the point I made earlier, which is that the role of the Global South has become Thank you. I'll end here.
Okay. Actually, the voice dropped quite a lot, and the role of the Global South was kind of missed.
Okay, let me try and type it out here.
No, it's yeah, you can do that, but thank you very much. I could actually get some really good points which you highlighted, that considering the global crisis that we are facing, of course, a lot of developmental progress that we had made has been reversed. But then at the same time, you also highlighted that there are opportunities out there, because the role of the global south, I mean, there's a space out there for the global south to kind of take and kind of present itself, perhaps because the global north has to an extent failed to kind of tackle the COVID situation or the global crisis that we are facing. So it is an opportunity for the global south to reclaim that responsibility for itself and kind of perform its role, which has not been performed perhaps all this time. So so this was an important contribution, and I would say an important point that has been raised. And yeah, so moving forward with the discussion, I would say, and it's important to consider that currently the world is home to around 1.8 billion young people, which are, I mean, between the ages of 10 to 24, which is like the largest generation of young people in its history. And interestingly, almost around 90% of this young population is living in developing countries. And this number is even expected to grow in, especially in the least developed regions. So based on these statistics and based on the number of young people as they are present, as they're sharing a significant percentage in this global demographic makeup. So my question would be to Talha, who is yet another young panelist for today. And my question to you would be that what do you think, what do we need to do to ensure that this youth bulge that we have does not really become a liability?
Hello guys. If we talk about the bulge of youth in any society, whether it's developed or an underdeveloped society, whether it's north or south, first we need to know the meaning of bulge. What is bulge? If we talk about the academic meaning of bulge, it is something increased from its natural state. So if youth increases in developing countries, it is a problem not for the developing countries alone, it's a problem for developed countries too. As I'm researching for this topic, what can I say? So I got an article and that states bulges of youth in Pakistan is a bomb for Pakistan, or is a bomb for Pakistan. So if we talk about the youth, especially in the developing countries, as 90% of the population of youth living in the developing countries, and 50% of them living in the Southeast Asian region, if we talk about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Afghanistan and Iran and all. So, but if we talk about the opportunities they have, there's none or there's too less for them. And only 10% of the youth living in a developed countries having opportunities in terms of good education with good medical facilities and other opportunities they have. Bulges of youth in developing countries is both threat and opportunity for the developed and developing countries. If we talk about how this is a threat to them, large number of people from India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh usually immigrate to the developing countries illegally, and the most common way, even Qazi knows, is they usually go from the Iran and the Turkey and all. So, and number of people belong to India, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. Youth were moving to developed countries illegally, which put burdens on the developed countries too. European Union. If we talk about around 383.3 billion is spent on per year on those illegal immigrants to stop them. But if we spend that money on the development of those youth in their own country by providing them good education, by providing them good vocational institutes like USAID and other are working in this country, so it would be great. So we can stop that from moving them from one place to another and creating a mess in the whole world. And how they can become an opportunity or a good sign for their own countries if they get good education, they have training, they have each and everything, so they can find a good job, they can help developing countries to become developed, which is, I personally think, which is one of the most important things. If any country wants to move from a developing state to a developed one, they need to work on their youth. As if their youth doesn't get better facilities or better equipments to work on, the country could not move to the developed countries. So, going on to the next thing, around 1.6 billion people from the world have applied for asylum in the developed countries, which is also one of the biggest problems for developed countries, as it's also creating problem in the developed countries. If we talk about UK or Australia and all, so they have less jobs for their own people, as people who have taken asylum from the developing countries, they can work over there on a low wage or low cost. So it also helps businesses to employ those employees who are immigrants, and they usually charge low from their local ones. So it also creates problem for the developed people who actually belong from a developed country. So we can stop this by spending more and more on youth of developing countries. And if we talk about more threats, I personally think I belong to that part of the world which have seen the crime, the terrorism, and all. And most of the people who are involved in these kind of activities are usually around 10 to 25 years of age. So if we want to stop the crime or the terrorism going on in the world or in the developing countries, we need to educate the young ones over there. We can increase the FDIs on those sectors which can help in developing the youth. Usually the foreign direct investment come in the developing countries does not spend over there. They usually spend on other things. So we need to move those things to the welfare of youth. And second and last is youth is backbone of any country, whether it's a developed or a developing country. If we haven't work on them, if we will not work on them, they're gonna create a lot of mess for their own country. So we need to start working on them. We need to give them more and more opportunities, and whole world need to put their efforts into it. It's not a responsibility of the own country. It's responsibility of every country in the world to develop the skills of the youth in the developing country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Talha, for your insights and for your comments on what possible areas that countries need to focus upon in order to ensure that the youth bulge or the number of young people that we have as an asset does not really become a liability. So moving forward with the talk, we have Harshana. She's joining us. She's originally from Mauritius, but she's currently joining us from the US. So Harshana, your primary interest lies in peace and conflict resolution. And interestingly, according to United Nations, some 600 million young people are living in conflict or fragile situations. So what role do you see for young people in this regard? How can they contribute towards national, regional, or even global peace? Is it even important for sustainability?
Okay, thank you so much, Kazi. Just let me know if you guys can hear me properly or if you're having any issues. Okay, great. So when we talk about youth in regard to peace and conflict resolution, we have to sort of consider what we mean and understand by saying that young people are drivers of peace and conflict prevention. And why are they important to begin with in this process? So why turn to the youth? Let's start by looking at some statistics. So according to a UN report, the estimate of direct conflict deaths suggests that more than 90% of casualties are young male adults. Now, along with that, the youth also suffer from poverty, unemployment, disintegration of families and communities, all which are direct consequences of conflict. So we see that young people account for a considerable share of people living in the developing world and in conflict areas. but they are often the ones left outside of the scope of decision-making and implementation of solution in society. Now, along with that, we also have to keep in mind that there have been several and numerous efforts that have been done to promote the inclusion of young people in peacekeeping. So, for example, the adoption of the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 initiated a movement which started recognizing young people as agents of change, acknowledging them as critical actors in conflict prevention and sustainable peace. Another example of that is Resolution 2282. In recognizing that the challenges of sustainable peace requires partnerships between stakeholders and youth organizations, the resolution reaffirmed the important role of youth in ensuring the success of peacekeeping and peace building. Now, the UN has also implemented several frameworks that seek to encourage youth participation in tackling global challenges. The UN Youth Strategy, for example, highlights the desire of young people to participate and contribute constructively to address global challenges, particularly in violence and in conflict zones. So unless we have a society that is committed to maintaining peace and providing security to all, our attempts at sustainable development will never truly and entirely flourish. So identifying and addressing the social exclusion of young people is a precondition of sustainable peace. So this leads me to another important point of consideration, which is that young people are sometimes seen through the lens of extremist groups' targets, especially those living in vulnerable and unstable regions. And this creates a distance between the youth population and government organizations. So excluding the youth from decision-making processes and providing them with little to no opportunity for civic engagement are some of the main reasons why violent extremism persists. So it becomes even more important to invest in youth to resist extremist notions and encourage them to make wiser, non-violent choices and invest their energy in peace and reconstruction. We have to understand how young people act like bridges and play a key role in connecting local actors in civil society organizations with, for example, decision-making actors who implement policies. And the point is that the youth are generally much better positioned to promote a culture of tolerance and peace at the local level, especially within the communities and among their peers. So young people generally possess a talent for communication and mobilization. So engaging and working together with the youth as an effective and positive partner continues to be a key priority in policies that are aimed at peacekeeping and peace and conflict prevention. So in all, we sort of really have to recognize that this attempt at building peace in societies and reconstructing societies isn't complete without the involvement of youth. So that is something that we have to consider, and we have to work harder towards. And there have been numerous attempts that have been done, but the work remains incomplete, as I've mentioned. So in short, I would say that youth and peace combined is an undeniable approach to sustainable development overall. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Harshana, for highlighting the aspect and the role of the youth, a possible role of the youth in resolving conflicts, which in turn have a lot of grave consequences, which can also reverse the progress that we make on sustainable development. With that being said, we will now formally move towards the last speaker, last but not the least. So I'll formally move towards Fedor, who's joining us from Russia. So my question would be that we already know, I mean, young people today are very much connected. So we are connected today. We are far more well-connected than we were before. And in fact, this connection has improved even more because of the COVID-19 situation, because there has been an unexpected surge in attaining virtual connectivity. So considering this situation, what do you think, how can youth actually leverage upon this interconnectedness for collective good? So I would really like to hear what you have to say, Fedor. Yeah, so the spotlight is on you.
Oh, hey, tell me if you can hear me well.
Yup.
Awesome, awesome. So interconnectivity, as Dr. Roy mentioned, the BRICS countries and overall the Asian and African, sub-Saharan African regions do grow a lot nowadays. And also it is known from the report of UN for 2019 that Southeast Asia and and also Central Asia and sub-Saharan regions, they have the largest youth population in the world right now, and it is going to grow. So right now, youth is gaining power. Those countries, they gain economic power, so the youth in those countries gain more power. Yeah. Okay, so COVID had a humongous effect on all the fields of society, and of course the SDGs and yeah, such goals as the no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being. Yeah, of course there was a detrimental effect, a huge harmful effect. However, it is surprising that COVID had a very positive impact on the implementation of the goal 17, which is the revitalization of global partnerships. And they are actually a mean of implementation of other 16 goals set by UN. So every generation has their own like priority problem, and for example 50 years ago that was gender equality, and there was women emancipation movement really in every sphere of society. Familiar to the older generations, so youth brings up new important questions on the table, and it's important to give power to these youth. As Harshana mentioned, youth is usually excluded from the conversation, and which this is very crucial. So the role of this internationalization and creation of global network is actually a way to set new priorities for the world, to solve those crucial problems, issues. There are other issues that I can think of, and that's raising awareness through social networks, information via DM, direct messages, and on your profile, magnifying the knowledge in this way. And this was very incentivized by the lockdown of COVID. Information spreads so fast. You know what, actually, what youth all over the world can relate to is memes. And this might be funny that we're talking about memes right here, but it is actually something that unites our generation, and the older generation cannot sometimes get it. But this form of art, it conveys a lot of information and about significant problems too. And sometimes I find out about news from memes. Okay, so one way youth can use this interconnectivity is even if you're not good at anything else, you can do memes. But there are other ways, for example, sharing and receiving knowledge. And there are summer schools, for example, the Youth Summer Research School we're participating in, and it became international this year thanks to the internet. And for example, my university's summer school this year became the largest it has been since its foundation. Then there are online education platforms as Coursera, online open education platform, and whatever. There are conferences, forums, and this all creates this network that can work together and spread information and reach those goals that are set worldwide. There's also a point for creating partnerships in trade, in research, and in various fields of society. It is important to make such efforts international. There is this synergic effect of international partnerships in trade and international trade and in research. Of course, this leads to innovation. Yeah, and youth is very good in innovating. So other points is creating civic society. As I said before, youth brings onto the table new questions, new priorities, and by uniting the power of hundreds of people in the country, then thousands, yeah, and millions outside of the country, it creates one movement that can actually make change. It becomes one big, powerful stakeholder that can affect the governments. Yeah, that comes to the point Harshana mentioned, that youth does not have this power it is supposed to. So by uniting in those big social groups, youth can actually make change. It can press the governments that can close their eyes on the youth. But if the youth unites, then they can make a difference. Yeah. And there is also, like, you know, Black Lives Matter movement. Youth plays a great role in it, and both spreading the information and both engaging you people in it. Okay. And probably one more point is yeah, relocation of resources. Now you have more time with COVID, and you can give a bit of your time on solving those global issues. And then there is creating networks of activists, and by participating in those global cultural exchanges, academic mobility programs, international events. Nowadays, it's really easy to do via the internet. And yeah, that's probably it. And I would probably say just make your effort, and it's extremely important to work together to solve global efforts, global problems. Sorry for speaking so long.
That's perfectly fine. Thank you so much, Fedor, for mentioning a lot of different points and possibilities for young people to engage in. I think this aspect of interconnection between young people is extremely important, because if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals per se, there are 17 goals altogether. And if you look at the 17th goal, which actually does talk about interconnection both on individual and institutional level, so which actually reflects that every goal of sustainable development eventually converges on this aspect of interconnectedness. So it's extremely important. And if people, young people, and if people in general and institutions are more connected today, that has a lot of different opportunities. Of course, there are challenges, but then opportunities as well. And how much we reap those opportunities, it all depends on individual and also as well as on the state level. So with that, all the speakers have mentioned and raised some really interesting points. And now we are moving towards question and answer session. I know the time, I mean, we'll not be having too much of time for the question and answer session, but we'll stick to only 10 more minutes for question and answers. And there are some questions here already, which I have kind of gathered in one spot. There are a couple of questions in which the speaker, the one who asked the question has mentioned who they need a response from. But for others, we can pose a question to all of the speakers, and whoever intends and wishes to respond can do so. So the first question that has been posed in the chat is, when talking about climate change, isn't carbon footprint of developed countries should be taken into account? How can we make policies regarding climate change where developed countries and corporations could be held accountable? Anyone can respond from the panelists. So if anyone wants to volunteer, you can do so. Or if you want me, I can pose a question to whoever I want. So Mia, maybe I think you want to say something.
Yes. So in answering the question, isn't the carbon footprint of developed countries should be taken into account? Absolutely. In fighting climate change, we won't be able to win that fight without developing countries. So the problem so much, I think, isn't how can we make policies. I think a lot of people have been pretty inventive and innovative in that area. I think the problem is implementing these policies. I saw a question later in the chat that was talking about, how do we get all these countries to agree on these really big issues? So as I said, I think the problem has to do with implementation. I know for the US, there's a lot of fracas around implementing, for example, working towards renewable energy. The Green New Deal was called for 100% renewable energy and through clean, renewable, and zero emission energy sources, and that's controversial. So these policies that people have been coming up with haven't been tested quite yet. But they're not getting the opportunity to be tested, if that makes sense. So yes, developed countries should be taken into account. Developed countries and corporations should definitely be held accountable. But a lot of this accountability is being driven and pulled by, I think, masses of many people, like of individuals, not necessarily like a big institutional figurehead, if that makes sense. So that's my 2 cents around the question.
That's interesting. Thank you so much, Mia, for responding. I think there were 2 questions pertaining to climate change, and I think you have referred and referenced to the second question as well. Drawing from those questions only, I would like to pose this question to Dr. Roy, actually, that we do know that the basic philosophy of sustainable development is that no one should be left behind, right? Because otherwise what would we actually understand sustainable as if there are people who are not really benefiting from the gains of development? So in this context, what stake do developing countries hold? I mean, the fight does not apparently seem to be equal, and they don't seem to be on equal footing. So how can this sustainability be really materialized in real sense?
I think that's an excellent question. Can you hear me all right? That's always a worry.
Yes.
I've changed places, as you can see. And that's what needs to be done, really. I think the stakes are enormously high, because we can argue about who was responsible for the problem, but the costs of ignoring sustainable development are just too high, and they will be borne by who live in the South, who do live in developing countries. The stakes for developing countries are really high, and I think one does need to, take very seriously the sort of discussion that happened just now in terms of thinking about corporate taxation that taxes those who are most responsible for enhanced carbon footprints. But also, I think one needs to think about reorganizing the representation of developing countries in global governance. One has to think about reorganizing and rethinking the representation of developing countries or the countries of the global South in such bodies as the United Nations and the World Bank and the IMF, where currently a lot of emphasis is given on who contributes financially to these institutions, rather than where do the poorest people live. And I think one needs to think about representation in ways that are much more conducive to and much more consistent with the questions of leaving no one behind. So which are the countries where people have been left behind? And remember, these are not people who have been left behind because they wanted to be left behind. They have been actively pushed behind by those who have surged forward. So you have to think about rethinking representation in these global governance bodies, not on the basis of financial contribution, not even on the basis of population, because then of course the Indias and the Chinas will very happily sort of dominate, but in terms of which countries comprise of the poorest people in the world. They need to have a voice at the table, at the decision-making table. So that's my very brief response to what is a very, very important question.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Roy. With that, I think I would also add a comment which has been shared on the chat, which is a very pertinent comment, as has been made by Ashar Khan, and he kind of resonates with you. So he says that we see that some parts of global South, for example, Kerala in India, have already embarked on a path of constant sustainable development, unhindered by global South, and unhindered by global and national political dynamics. However, their success stories remain relatively unheard, often shadowed by the first world mantra of economic growth. So I think this actually does, so this aspect of representation in the areas of global governance actually makes a lot of sense, because we can not only just look at the numbers, we also need to look at the representation of the developing countries, because that representation itself then defines what policies on a global level are actually being devised, and where the power, and from where the power actually flows, which in turn defines the power balance on a global level. So yeah, so with that, I would actually move forward with some more questions that have been mentioned on the chat. So for Harshana, there is a question that has been posed by Aisha Kudpar, and I would say that your team member is not coming too easy on you. So yeah, the question is, what are some key and general obstacles according to you which affect youth engagement in peace building activities? So yeah, a question to you if you would want to respond, maybe a brief response.
Okay, thank you for that question, Aisha. I think that, you know, youth are often marginalized, especially during political transitions. Political power often tends to flow to adult leadership and political elites. So, so some of these dynamics were also vividly seen during the Arab Spring. And also the pattern of youth activists being outmaneuvered by older and more experienced political actors is very widespread, and it cuts across different regions and regime types. So youth are subordinate to adult elites who make political decisions, sign peace accords, decide on aid distribution, and make important decisions regarding peace building within the country. So as such, youth often tend to get to be left out of many aspects of peace building. And this is more of an ironic contradiction if you think about it, given that young people are the ones who are most affected and traumatized by violence and conflict. So it is definitely a set of processes around which further reflection, dialogue, and research needs to be conducted. And I think when we talk about obstacles, this is secondary, but something else that comes to mind is also war trauma and illiteracy are also some obstacles that prevent youth from engaging in peace building activities, so they are unable to contribute to that process of peace building. So in that sense, to be able to successfully engage young people in positive transformative process, that depends on the creation of enabling safe environments that provide multiple ways for the youth to get involved and sustain their involvement, and using dialogue as a healing tool for themselves and people within their communities.
Okay, thank you so much, Harshana, for responding to that question. Okay, I would really appreciate if someone from the team facilitators could actually, you know, look at the chat and let me know if I've skipped any question, because I've tried to keep track of the questions, but there's a possibility that I might have skipped any. We are running out of time. I had already, you know, given heads up to Dr. Roy that, you know, normally virtual programs do get, I mean, we do require 10 to 15 extra minutes for them. It just happens normally. So I'm apologizing in advance. So I would borrow a question from the chat only, which more or less, I mean, is more or less the same as to which Harshana has already responded, but I would try to change it a bit. It has been asked by Shubhra, if I'm not mistaken. But when we talk about giving opportunities to young people or giving platforms for young people for representation, do you even think that young people are, I mean, it's being posed to anyone who would want to answer. Do you really think that even young people are actually ready for that sort of representation? Where do we set the balance between representation and then giving them or equipping them with the required skill set, which is which is essential for them to make use of that representation. So, I mean, this question is being posed to anyone, and anyone can really answer from the panelists, actually. So maybe Mwaniki, if you would want to answer to that question, you know, balancing between the representation and the skill set.
Yeah, thanks, Kazi. I think the main argument would be giving the right tools to the right people. You are a young person and already being quite marginalized, it's quite apparent that there are gatekeepers and there are people who are out to, you know, say that he's not equipped or she's not equipped. So the UN model talks about bringing in young people and equipping them, putting them together with already seasoned individuals in the field. So if we give you a platform, we tell you as a young person, come in and give your expertise. We then align a person who is more seasoned to give an advisory, to serve an advisory purpose, to give that advisory push. That then serves the purpose as that I had talked about, the affirmative action part, making sure that we have slots that are specifically allocated to young people, giving young people the chance to actually go out there. And we have to understand that mistakes will be made. However, we are ready to face the consequences, because we have we already have the advisors, we already have we have equipped this individual with the right education, political education, civic education, and formal education. It's all about mainstreaming the young people. And I think just to add on, there was a question that sorry to butt in, but there was a question on the chat about taxation of the MNCs, and I would like to answer it really quickly, Kazi, if you'd allow me. I talk about pay your fair share. So the question was, how can MNCs be taxed less than enterprising youth, as governments can extract larger taxes from bigger companies? And yes, you can extract larger taxes from bigger companies. However, the question is, pay your fair share. It's very unfair for an MNC to be taxed at 6%, yet a young enterprising individual is taxed at up to 30%. And on top of that, we have VAT. We have all the other indirect taxes. VAT, where it applies, goods and services taxes where they apply. I think it's quite unfair to have MNCs pay less, being very cognizant of the fact that these MNCs also engage in transfer mispricing, aggressive tax planning. These are all aspects that we have to consider. So bottom line, pay your fair share. Thanks, Kazi.
Okay, thank you so much, Allan. And I would request Dr. Roy to add to the same question of, you know, balancing between the representation of the youth and, you know, building their skill set essential to exploit and to make use of that representation.
Yeah. Mine is more of a question to the panelists rather than a comment, because I think I've commented too much, but I'd like to hear from the panelists and maybe anybody else on this. We've had some really interesting reflections on representation, and thanks so much for the point about affirmative action for young people. I think that's a really useful sort of lens. But I wondered, I wanted to know, you know, what this panel thought about the question of young people's representation in government. Do you think that's something to be fought for, or do you think that's something that you know, it's going to be more useful ensuring young people's representation in other spheres of public life, such as civil society organizations or corporates or NGOs or international or multilateral organizations? Sorry, this is a very broad question. Anyone can pick it up, but I couldn't resist having such brilliant people here and not asking this question.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Roy. It's an interesting question indeed. In fact, we have one group that is specifically working and researching on this theme of youth and political engagement, actually. So I think anyone, so as you mentioned, so either someone from the panelists or anyone from the audience, if somebody would want to unmute your mic and chime in. So maybe someone from the group of youth and political engagement, or anyone from the audience can actually chime in and respond to what Dr. Roy has actually posed as a question. Yeah, so looking forward to your response. So just wait for a minute and let's see who wishes to respond.
Yeah, I'm sorry for bringing this up at towards the end when you're trying to wind up, but I couldn't resist.
No, No, I think it's a brilliant question, and actually, because the thing is, it has posed a really rightful point, because unless and until young people do not have a representation in the government, that aspect of the main power corridor is still blocked if young people are not there. So yeah, I mean, looking forward to comments and responses from maybe from the panelists and from the audience, anyone who wishes to say.
Yeah, I would like to say a little bit. So I'm from the group Corruption and Political Integrity, and there are two other people here from this same group. As I mentioned in my speech before, the youth is actually an actor that brings new priorities to the table, and it is extremely important for me, from my standpoint, that youth gets involved in governing and policy making, because this is the way they can not only just press the government to do it, but be the government to do it. And for example, in Russia, it's actually coming back to the situation that happened in the middle of the previous century, when there was a situation of gerontocracy happening. So the government gets older and older, but there's no turnover in power. So the main actors get older and the priorities don't change. So there is no innovation, there is no real development. Older people tend to go for stability instead of development and innovation. So in my humble opinion, it is extremely important to have youth in the government. And of course, there are a lot of very smart people who are young. And I don't think that that the level of persons' integrity in their actions and the level of their intellectual power depends on the age. So youth has to be involved in government, in governing policymaking.
Okay.
Thank you. That's very helpful to know. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think Mia wanted to say something.
One quick line. I think as an addendum, youth should be involved in government, but they also should be involved at the highest levels of, I think, every sector. So I don't think it's an either or, picking between government and participation in other industries. I think, I don't see why not. Youth can be everywhere.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for your participation. I would like to extend my warmest gratitude to each one of you. Thank you so much, Dr. Roy, for joining in, for giving us your valuable time. I understand that before you joined in, you were busy in another meeting. So I totally appreciate for your time, for joining us for this panel talk. I really thank each and every one of you as part of the participants. I know some of the questions might have been skipped. I really apologize, but I think we are running, we're running short on time. We are already overdue by 20 minutes. So I would like to thank the participants who are here and who were an amazing audience and asked a lot of questions and were not too easy on their group members. And I would also like to thank the young panelists. Thank you, Mia. Thank you, Harshana. Thank you, Allan. Thank you, Fedor. And thank you, Talha, for being here and for being amazing participants and a representation of the youth who were actually the center of and the focal point of discussion for today. So it was an interesting discussion, and interesting points were actually raised, and interesting insights were actually brought into discussion. So I'm sure this might feed into your own discussions in your own respective groups, or it will at least make you thinking about your role as young people and how can you actually participate in this broader developmental discourse, first understand it and then play your part in order to make sure that we truly do move ahead with this global objective of sustainable development. So with that being said, I would really thank each and every one of you for being here for this panel talk. You were all amazing. And so my sincerest thank you once again. And I thank you on behalf of Youth Center for Research as well, that actually organized this panel talk as part of the summer research program. So with that being said, I would formally end the call, and with that, the session will formally end. So thank you once again.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. That was really amazing for me.
Okay, great. Thank you. Take care of yourselves, please.